Hello, and welcome to Polaris Design Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the team and the topic that is exploring player contracts. So first off, I would love it if you could introduce yourself and tell us why you decided to start this topic.
Hi, I'm Jason Grinblat, the co-founder and creative head at Freehold Games. And yeah, this is an interesting topic. This came to me because I had saw someone post this provocative post on social media about saying you should lie to your players, or you should have it in your toolkit to lie to your players. And I was trying to examine my own feelings about that and unpack what they meant. And along that kind of path of discovery was this idea of we're always sort of in these contracts with our players. Some of them are explicit, some of them are implicit. Sometimes we are keeping to those contracts. Sometimes we're kind of violating them. Sometimes we're not even aware we're in a contract. And so just kind of mapping out the space of what's going on there was appealing to me. And it seemed like the exact type of topic a bunch of Polaris designers coming together to hash out would produce something fruitful.
Yeah. So as you were exploring, what were some of the questions you were trying to answer and some of the key principles that kept coming up in your discussion?
Yeah, there was a lot of, I think, whenever you're trying to align on a topic like this, there's a lot of vocabulary and definitions that get sort of hashed out. So for us, it was, there's this word contract, which looms large over our topic. So it was like figuring out, what is a contract? What is a promise, a player promise? That's another term that gets used. And is it the same? We also have expectations, all of these kind of floating around, and how they settle once they're all in the conversation together. And then just kind of really picking apart what each of our team members came to the topic looking for, and also how we sort of developed that alignment as the day went on. Because I think this was a challenging topic, I would say. This was a topic where there's so many different angles to tackle it from that I think the direction we're kind of leaning into now is an interesting one, but a lot of other exploration is possible.
Are you still working on kind of honing down what that is? Because it is quite broad and there's lots of different interpretations. So
yeah. I think we had yesterday we didn't put the pressure on ourselves to do that. I know sometimes in groups I've been in, by the end of the first day, you do feel a pretty strong sense of direction, and I feel like we didn't, but that was okay because we just gave ourselves that freedom to just get all the ideas down. And then this morning we had some good clarifying conversations, and in particular, someone came to our group to get their advice on their own game pitch, which they thought they were making certain promises for that they weren't intending. And it was actually really clarifying for us. It was that's an example that includes all of the factors we've been talking about, and also helps us kind of tease apart what we're doing ourselves. So I think now the sort of situating statement that we're working from is you are in a lot more contracts with your players than you might think. And it's good to have that framework to be aware of there are expectations here that the player is expecting. And it's not necessarily that you have to meet them, but you have to be aware of that so that maybe you can make that contract more explicit when you're not delivering something, or maneuver to reframe the contract, or bring the player along in some way to get them to have buy-in that while you might not be delivering what they expected, this is what you are delivering, and this is, So that whole kind of space of that whole problem space is what we're dealing with, and in particular, kind of the framing statement of whether you know it or not, and whether you've stated it or not, you're sort of in a contracts with your players all the time.
Yeah. Did you find yourself kind of categorizing different sections of that? Like, what were your categories like?
Yeah, I mean, there's a big one that came up over and over is the explicit versus the implicit contract, right? And the language that gets used to signal those things. So something that might be explicit was like on your Steam page, you might say, we're a retro adventure game. Now, even that, like that's an explicit statement that's going to carry its own connotations, some of which might be implicit. I think Daniel Cook, who's on our team, has a really great example, a very explicit contract where they put on their Steam page, you could actually get Valve to tag this little red notice on your page where it says like, notice in red, this game is meant to be played 1 or 2 hours a day, right? And that's about as explicit as you can get, right? This is like, hey, look, this is because what was happening is people were not aware of that. They'd come to the game, they'd expect to be able to grind beyond what the game allowed them to. There was a sense of disconnect there when they couldn't. When at its worst feels like betrayal. Maybe it wasn't quite escalated to that stage, but so that's a way to be very explicit about your contract. There are other ways where, sometimes the contracts are implicit, and this was where Osama Dorias came to our team, had a trailer for a game that is a mix of 2 genres, but very strongly signals one of those genres. And all of the, was relaying stories to us about the expectations that players had after seeing that trailer and all the ways in which, those initial signifiers that are in your marketing copy, your trailers, screenshots of your game, even before the players make contact with your game, are going to invoke expectations. And so, I think I'm playing a fighting game, and so I'm expecting A, B, and C that fighting games should have, and how to sort of maneuver around that when you might have A and B but not C. And then what we started to talk about in terms of like the life cycle of contracts is that we talked about this initial period where maybe it's before players even come into contact with your game. They're looking at trailers, they're seeing screenshots, maybe they're playing a demo, and they're kind of laden with genre expectations, right? Because genre looms so large in games. That's one set of problems. But then, you have another set. Maybe you have players who've been playing with your game for a while. They know that you deviate from the genre in these specific ways. There's sort of a new baseline established. Now, there's still this kind of idea of an implicit contract here where the game is a certain type of way, and that's either not going to change, or maybe if I get further into the game, something's not going to happen to significantly subvert what I feel like has been the established contract. Or if it does subvert it, hopefully it's in a way that feels good and delightful, right? And not like disappointing and frustration. So there's different types of contract breaking itself, but kind of managing contracts throughout that whole life cycle of the game. Like, we're a live service game and we're changing how something works. We're actually changing the contract. How can you, from a community management perspective, engage players in a way with language that lets them know you're changing the contract and why you're doing it, and to get buy-in from them and to manage your trust, which is very key.
Yeah. Do you ever, did you have any conversations about when people intentionally break those contracts, or kind of intentionally like do something different than what they seemingly promise?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about, trust and how difficult it is to earn it back once you sort of fall off a certain cliff where there's a real sort of like phase change of feeling like trust is lost. And so the hope is to hedge that off, right? To get in front of that and be explicit where you need to be, where to say like, hey, look, this is actually this thing you're expecting, which maybe comes from all sorts of sources and signifiers. We're actually doing something a little different, and so we might communicate that in game, like maybe ideally through gameplay, in fact, but also through all of the other sort of meta channels around the game. And even prior to that, like the ideal is to using a framework of contracts and thinking about realizing that you're kind of embedded, you're buying into these contracts just by being in the developer and player dynamic, right? And understanding some of the unintentional side effects, maybe the negative spaces of your designs that are kind of implying things, making sure you're aware of what those are, so that you know that like you may end up violating a contract that you didn't even know you were in.
Yeah. Do you talk about what to do if you find out that you have violated
if
something?
you find out you have, we spent less time on that and more time on the hedging, but I think there's been some discussion around like how difficult it is to get that trust back. But also, like, I think No Man's Sky was brought up as a example, right? Whereas like there was a perception that certain promises made at launch did not square with the experience of the game. But then there's been this sort of atypical like journey since then of like just grinding that trust back over time and delivering on slowly but surely and continuously on some of those promises, and the new promises being made in a consistent way has really kind of like steered the ship in the right direction. I don't know if we've gotten much more nuance than that.
I think that's fine. I mean, it seems like it's very focused on a certain part of that. Did you find anything surprising in your conversations, or did it just solidify what you already knew, but just like honed it in?
No, I think we were definitely a little bit of both, I guess. Definitely like unpacking some of the intuitions we had. A lot of what we're saying now in our in our presentation, and then ultimately what we think we're going to say in our report does square with what we were coming in with. But also I think we have a little bit of a firmer understanding of the contract. Contract is obviously a metaphor we're borrowing from law, from like a legal context that has real contracts. We don't have real contracts typically. There are terms of service and whatnot, but like in the design context we're talking about, it is a little like it's still more of a metaphor, right? And so understanding why the metaphor works and where it does, we really kind of hit on this idea that like the contract is sort of a mechanism to take conflicting interests where there's a possible site of tension, and to kind of like shape that tension in a productive way so that both parties feel like they are getting what they need. And in this case, it's like most reductively, it's game developer and player, let's say. Game developer and player. And even just going through and enumerating all of the needs and desires a game developer might be bringing to the table, like, oh, I need to keep the studio lights on. I have this artistic intention. I have, it's a variety of different needs. The player's bringing a variety of different needs. And so seeing the contract as a site of negotiation or like mutual delivery of those needs was useful. And then I think, let me think. There was something else we were surprised by. I don't know. Let me put a pin on that and we'll get back to that maybe.
Were there any like hot topics? Was everyone pretty much in alignment, or were there?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of alignment around this being like present and being like the statement, you're in more contracts than you maybe are aware that you are with your players. Everyone kind of felt and intuited and believed in. I think what each of us was coming to the topic to, like what orientation we're coming to the topic was actually varied quite a bit, even more than other topics I've been in. So like, there was someone who was coming in thinking like, well, how do I manage community? How do I like head off these like bad situations where we've really broken a contract that we weren't even aware we were in, and now the community is mad at us. There was someone who came in thinking like, well, I'm making a game that's a little different than the genre it's in, and I want to communicate that in the game. Or is there language I can use to talk to players that will help them realign their expectations, like rewrite that contract in game? I was actually coming at it from like thinking about that question of, how do I feel about lying to my own players? I have conflicted feelings about it. What is my orientation around feeling like I'm in a contract with the player, but I'm also in a contract with the game itself as like a work, its own living thing, feeling like there are principles I'm designing toward that even separate from the player's concerns, I have to be true to. And then how that itself, maybe if communicated well, becomes a sort of contract with the player. Like the player's like, oh, I'm going to let them cook because they're doing something interesting that I know what they want to do. And I'm not going to really, I always have some expectations, but I'm not going to be as demanding with them as maybe if I might come to another game with. And so, yeah, we had just a lot of ways contracts, which is a very broad concept, can be applied. And I think I think the report itself, it'll have to wait till the report to really hash out how much of that we cover. I think for the focus for our presentation, where we really want to like put the at least the short-term spotlight, we're kind of centered around a few ideas. One is situating it in the idea that you want to be aware as a developer. You want to look at the implications of your designs and everything in your game, your visuals, your marketing, to know what those implicit promises are and what you're getting yourself into, and to be able to steer out of it when you are getting into situations that are going to cause you trouble.
Yeah. It almost feels like I would want a checklist, like, check this.
Checklist has been talked about. I think with one of our potential formats is checklists. So yeah.
Nice. So a lot of the groups often talk about tangential topics that keep coming up that are more adjacent to their topic.
Yeah.
That help define and help focus their topic, but aren't directly the topic. Did you have any of those?
I mean, one that came up a lot was a report we did a few years ago on what we called system suspense, which is where it was like these two related concepts that we hashed out in the paper: system suspense and system surprise. And it's we're kind of like borrowing from the narrative suspense, where a game with its systems and its mechanics swerves in a way in order to like break your expectations and kind of blow your mind. Because a lot of us that came to the topic really like these experiences. So extreme examples might be like an Inscription like game, or Frog Fractions, where it's like it's a whole different type of game that you actually were playing, or like the game is much bigger and longer than you thought it would be, right? And I think we all realized in talking about the contracts is that like, oh, this is related because it's about player expectation, right? It's like, oh, we're breaking player expectation. It's kind of the dual, because it's like with the system suspense and surprise, it was set up such that this breaking of the expectations is meant to be positive and delightful. And like, and with the contract, the breaking of the expectation tends to have a negative connotation. And we gave the example of like, if I'm contracted with you to give you 10 apples for however much you're paying me, and I give you 11 apples, that's not what the contract says, but you don't really view it as a violation of the contract, right? Because you just got more of what you wanted. So there's this idea of like violation really coming back to the idea of like the tension that's created between the conflicting interests being really key about managing the contract, versus like breaking expectations in ways that serve the player interest are kind of a different thing, which was represented in that paper.
Yeah. I have a final question for you. If you were to distill the conversations that you've had in the past few days, and you were to take, I'd say I'll give you one or two favorite conversations or highlight takeaways, what would they be?
I think I really like hitting on this idea that you're immersed in these. Everything you do is a signifier for something. There's an implication from it. And you kind of can't simply, I mean, this helped clarify some of my own design practice, I guess is why I like it, is that you can't simply create a thing without thinking of, you both have to think of the ramifications of what the thing is doing, but also what the lack of all the other things you didn't do are doing, what the genre expectations are, and you're not necessarily beholden to these things like, I cannot make a weird split genre game because the people in the roguelike genre are going to want too much for me. It's more just that you have to really be aware that these are all forces you're managing and that you can find yourself in a contract with a player with a group of players who believe that they are owed a certain set of things from a certain type of game. Once you recognize that as like the position you're in, I think these mitigation strategies become helpful to you. So that whole idea, I think, was really clarifying. I think I never really thought deeply about kind of the contract. It's a contract. It's a thing in the world that I know about. But like, I really like this kind of metaphor of the tension, right? It's like there's tension produced between the conflicting interests. If we have completely aligned interests, we don't need a contract typically because even though we're still two people with our different needs, like there's nothing to negotiate ultimately. Now, there probably is really because our needs are not quite aligned, and that's why a contract even in that situation might be good. But it's really with those the possibility for the conflicting needs that the technology of the contract sort of evolves. And there was someone from our group made this great analogy of like contracts sort of like coming into reality based on the pressure put on them. So meaning like a contract's never really important until it's litigated or like it's really when the forces of like the violation put pressure on the terms that the terms come into use and come into like a certain type of crystal clarity. And that is useful because also like on the flip side, we had this idea that you don't necessarily want to come to your players and tell them all the things you're not going to deliver, right? Like that's a framing. That's what Seth called framing defensively, like being on the back foot. Like that's a framing that is like setting players up to have expectations that they might not have even had, right? So like you don't necessarily want to. The contractual framing is a tool itself. It's not one you want to like drop into at all times. And that was a useful and interesting realization.
Yeah, so it's not really hard set. It's just something to be aware of and then kind of adjust to.
And you might have to make it hard set. You might have to say, like, it's time now that we be explicit about this. But you don't necessarily have to start there.
That's great. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I'm really excited to hear more about this later. So yeah. I can't wait for that paper.
Yeah, we're excited to get it out.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nina.